There's a truth most of us only understand when we step into a winter night in the far north. Darkness isn't just the absence of light. It's a living force, heavy, sinking from the sky like a black curtain that squeezes every sound out of the air and suspends the world somewhere between existence and nothingness. For the Vikings, winter wasn't simply cold. It was a months-long siege, a season where the sun rose only as a faint memory, and the cold crept into every fiber of the longhouse, every breath, every night of sleep. In that reality, fire wasn't a comfort. It was the final thread holding a human being to the living side of the world, a fragile anchor against an endless night swallowing everything outside. Yet keeping that fire alive through those long hours was nearly impossible when every log came at the cost of blood and sweat, and a single night without flame could trap a family in a deadly vice of freezing air. In those moments, when blizzards screamed across the roof and every eye focused on the last remaining glow in the room, the Vikings were forced to discover a different kind of fire, a source of heat and light that didn't depend on wood, a solution far more durable than anything their era should have allowed. And if you've ever believed they survived winter through brute strength or sheer courage, this story will make you reconsider everything. Keep watching to see how they turned something seemingly worthless into a survival technology that shaped an entire civilization. When winter reached its most merciless stage, when winds sharp as blades swept over the roof and turned the whole valley into a giant box of ice, the real problem for the Vikings wasn't knowing how to start a fire, but how to keep that fire alive through endless nights where every single log became a life or death decision. The stockpile gathered in summer looked abundant, yet just a few back-to-back snowstorms could empty it terrifyingly fast. Every dry branch thrown into the flames felt like throwing away tomorrow's chance of survival, and even the smallest mistake in how the wood was used could leave a family waking up inside a house as cold as a frozen tomb. The Vikings understood this so deeply that their old sayings always carried a warning. A family can die because of a single wrong piece of wood.
Don't worry, little one.
And on those nights when the wind howled like a voice calling from the edge of the world, while the fire inside the longhouse sank into embers, they had no choice but to accept that a flame, completely dependent on wood, would never be enough to defeat a northern winter. Out of that desperation, they were forced to find another kind of fire, a solution durable, efficient, and able to endure the whole night even as the storm roared outside. What surprises most modern people isn't that the Vikings found an alternative to firewood, but what they chose to replace it with, a decision that goes completely against what we think of as survival logic. While we assume that getting through winter means relying on the most valuable resources, they discovered that the most stable source of energy wasn't in the forest at all. It was inside the very animals that kept them alive. The same thing that nourished their bodies could also sustain their flame. The biggest twist is this. The fuel that saved them from brutal northern winters was something most of the world still considers waste. Scraps of fat, leftover fat, rancid fat, the discarded bits from butchering, even the thin layer of grease boiled off bones in moments of desperation. The Vikings didn't just use high-quality animal fat. They used every unwanted piece, turning it into a concentrated, long-lasting fuel so potent that a single small handful could keep a corner of the house warm and lit for hours. Something piles of wood might not manage in a snowstorm. This didn't just change how they heated their homes. It changed how they saw the world. There was no such thing as waste, only resources that hadn't been used properly. And when you realize a civilization survived using something the rest of humanity ignored, you start to understand how the Vikings endured places where even modern machinery struggles. If you've ever imagined surviving on a ridiculous source of energy like this, drop a comment. I genuinely want to know which part of this story surprised you the most. The origin of the Viking fat lamp didn't come from a random moment. It came from a chillingly sharp observation. They realized that the same fat that kept their bodies alive during the day could also keep a flame alive at night. And once those two truths were placed side by side, a kind of second fire began to appear in every longhouse, small but steady, like the heartbeat of the home itself. The Vikings didn't create fat lamps to replace the central hearth. They created them because they needed a fire that knew how to be patient, a flame that didn't devour resources, but sipped just enough to hold back the months-long darkness outside. And it was that humility that became its strength. The fat lamp wasn't bright. It didn't crackle like wood, but its thick yellow glow reached into every corner of the house, settling on the tired face of a father repairing tools, lighting the hands of a mother twisting wool, and warming the eyes of children listening to sagas before drifting into sleep. Strangely, while the world sees this as a simple household item, to the Vikings, it was part of their survival. A quiet, automatic life support system that kept warmth and light alive even when the main fire had long burned out. If you've ever tried imagining what it feels like to step into a home lit only by these silent fat lamps, share your thoughts. It might be very different from what you picture as peace in the Viking Age. What set the Viking fat lamp far above other crude tools of its era was the material they placed the flame into. A humble stone so unremarkable you could step over it without ever knowing it was once valued more highly than iron. Soapstone. At first glance, it's just a soft gray rock. But when the Vikings discovered it could withstand direct flame without cracking, breaking, or weakening, and even more importantly, that it could hold heat longer than any other stone, they turned it into the quiet heart of the longhouse heating system. Soapstone absorbed the fire from the fat lamp slowly, like a living ember, then released that warmth little by little into the surrounding darkness, creating a kind of heating that no longer depended entirely on the flame itself. An enormous advantage on nights when no more wood could be burned and the people inside were exhausted from fighting the storms outside. Even more astonishing is that the softness of this stone allowed them to carve it with the simplest tools, turning each piece into lamp bowls, cooking pots, even metal casting molds, all relying on the same thermal secret humanity wouldn't fully appreciate until centuries later. Just when the Vikings believed they had exhausted everything nature could possibly offer them, it was the marshes, those dark, cold, ominous lands long seen as gateways to the world of spirits, that delivered a gift so strange it felt like something pulled straight from legend. A soft, damp material that grew in shadows, silent beneath the mist, yet could keep a flame alive longer than any fiber they had ever known. This was bog moss, sphagnum, the secret weapon their ancestors discovered not through theory, but through raw survival instinct, when a desperate hunter stuffed a handful of wet moss into a soapstone bowl just to test his luck, and found something completely illogical. Cold, damp moss, born of dead land, carried oil so well that the flame clung to it like a starving creature. From that moment on, bog moss became the soul of the fat lamp, a substance so eerie and useful that the Vikings spoke of it with the same respect they gave sacred charms. They gathered it in silence, dried it under rare shafts of sunlight, and twisted it into thick strands so that each time the lamp was lit, its dim yellow glow seemed to carry the breath of the marsh. Trustworthy, yet faintly haunting in a way you can only sense when standing beside it in the dark. The lesson is unsettling. Sometimes what keeps humans alive isn't rare material or refined technique, but something that grows quietly in a place no one wants to tread. If you've ever come across a material both strange and incredibly useful like this, share your thoughts. Your small stories might reveal more of the secrets nature is still hiding. Among all the seemingly simple Viking inventions, nothing confuses modern researchers more than their immortal flame, a fat-burning system that could sustain itself for 24 hours without anyone tending it, as if they had created a primitive version of a tiny thermal reactor powered more by instinct than science. The secret didn't lie in a complicated structure, but in three elements coming together with an almost eerie perfection. A heavy soapstone bowl that stored heat like a stone heart, a solid block of fat left whole and uncut, and a wick of moss peeking just a few millimeters above the surface. When the flame touched the tip of the wick, it generated just enough heat to melt the layer of fat beside it, forming a tiny pool of oil that always stayed in balance. The smaller the flame, the slower the oil melted. The slower it melted, the longer the flame endured. A self-regulating mechanism that's hard to believe existed more than 1,000 years ago. Stranger still, whenever the flame weakened, the preheated stone kept melting the fat on its own, feeding the wick even without active fire, preventing the system from ever fully dying out. A quiet but incredibly efficient loop. Thanks to this, the Vikings could sleep through the night knowing a silent light keeper was still watching over them, holding the warmth, the glow, and the life of the household. Stepping into a Viking longhouse on a winter night doesn't feel like entering a house. It feels like stepping into a sleeping creature, where the light from the fat lamps isn't arranged by human logic, but by the breathing rhythm of the space itself. At the center, the hearth burns low like a dark red heart, yet its light never reaches the far corners of the home. Instead, small wall alcoves cut directly into the thick turf glow with dull yellow light from fat lamps tucked neatly inside, creating the uncanny impression of ancient eyes watching every movement in the dark. Above, a few hanging lamps swaying from iron rings move with every whisper of wind slipping through the roof, their trembling glow falling across the floor like wandering demon eyes waiting for someone to step into their circle. And the standing lamps cast long shadows like spears driven into the ground around a military camp, making every step more cautious. It's this half-intentional, half-instinctive distribution of light that gives the longhouse its strange nighttime aura. Part refuge, part battleground where light and darkness constantly wrestle like two living forces. What most modern people struggle to accept, yet was completely obvious in Viking life, is that their longhouse functioned like a biological heat engine that any 21st century engineer would treat with caution. It wasn't just a shelter, but a living organism, a giant thermal flask powered by fire, humans, and livestock. The 1-meter-thick turf walls weren't walls in the way we think of them, but more like the hide of an ancient creature, soft, rough, and so insulating that the inside warmed little by little just from the breath of the living. The heavy earth roof above wasn't simply there to keep out the rain. It acted like a slow lung, absorbing warmth from below and releasing it at night, as if the house itself were regulating its own temperature. And the most shocking part is that the very thing we consider an inconvenience, livestock, was the greatest secret in their heating system. Cows, goats, and sheep slept in the adjoining section, radiating enormous heat that, combined with the warmth of several dozen people, created a collective furnace so powerful that just a handful of fat lamps were enough to maintain warmth through the night. Compared to modern homes that depend on electricity, gas, and an army of machines, this reveals a slightly ironic truth. Sometimes ancient technology operates smarter, more sustainably, and far more humanly than the way we build our world today. If there's one thing that forces us to pause and think after seeing the Vikings' entire survival system, it's a simple but haunting question. How did a civilization with no electricity, no machinery, and none of our modern technology turn things we consider waste into a heating system so sustainable it could run through an entire winter without missing a beat? When you piece everything together, a 24-hour fat lamp, a heat-storing soapstone bowl, marsh moss wicks, turf walls like animal hide, a roof that breathes, and the combined warmth of humans and livestock, you begin to realize the Vikings didn't just build survival tools. They built a philosophy of life, where every scrap of fat, every stone, every handful of moss held an irreplaceable role in the war against the cold. The most shocking part is that this system wasted nothing. Good fat for food, lower quality fat for preserving goods, bone skim for burning, fish oil for light, even rancid grease kept as a last-chance fuel. All of it existed in a complete energy cycle that the modern world, dependent on electricity, fossil fuels, and industry, is still trying to recreate, often clumsily. And in that sense, the Vikings may have been thousands of years ahead of us. If you see a lesson here that today's world should remember, share your thoughts. I'd love to know which detail struck you the most. And if you want to keep exploring ancient secrets like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of the journey, because our ancestors did far more things right than we ever imagined.